I'm Lonnie Perrine, and I was asked to speak a little bit about what it was like when I was young, growing up on the Sunray farm where my granddad um, raised cucumbers and made barrels and barrels of pickles. So, what I remember when I was young, probably like 5, 6 years old, um, Grandpa, he had fields and fields of cucumbers. And in the spring, he couldn't get people to help plant cucumbers. So he'd get family members and he'd say, let's go plant cucumbers. And so I was 5 or 6 years old. I'd go out there with Grandpa. He had an old Alice Chalmers tractor with a little wagon behind it, and he'd throw all of his garden stuff and seeds in there. And we'd go up in the fields and we'd start planting cucumbers. And he had acres and acres of these things. Well, from my perspective, the monster fields. And Grandpa would give me a sack of seeds, and he'd say, "Okay, now we're going to plant these." Well, after about a half hour, an hour, you just, 5 or 6 year old, you kind of lose your interest in this stuff. And pretty soon I was kind of hiding seeds in places. Grandpa found the seeds, and he wasn't happy. But it got to be so long a days doing that, and seed was expensive, I suppose. But anyway, so he'd get his fields planted, and we got them all planted, and then would come time to hoe the weeds around these gardens. Now I don't know if Grandpa had a cultivator for his tractor, but I don't remember that. But I remember Grandpa spending hours and hours hoeing out there, and he'd carry his hoe out early in the morning. He'd stay out there most all day, and he'd come home in the evenings. And I remember him telling me, he says, I just eat 2 meals a day. I eat before I go out in the mornings, and again when I come back at night. And I'm thinking, wow, Grandpa, how do you do all this? But this was like in the late 50s, early 60s when this was going on. Well, my grandpa was Don Perrine. Lived out at Heideland Lake in Heideland Township. And this is where he had his pickle business, the Sunray Farm out there. And my dad is Nash Perrine, and he helped, because it's family business going on. And so a few years ago, they interviewed my dad to see, to take his perspective of what it was like. Well, I'm like third generation. And when I come, in the 50s and 60s, the business was kind of on its downswing at that point, but he still would have several hundred of barrels of cucumbers or pickles, barrels of pickles out there that he made. When as the summer went along and it come time to harvest these cucumbers, same thing. Grandpa had a hard time finding people and laborers to come and do this. So he'd go over to Fargo where the migrant workers were, and whoever was available, he'd bring them back for the harvest and stuff. But couldn't always get help. So once again, family got to go out and harvest cucumbers. And so I remember Grandpa giving me this gunny sack, and that's what we picked them in. The gunny sack was bigger than I was. And I'm going, Grandpa, you want me to fill this up? Yep, I want you to fill up a bunch of them. Well, after about so long, you fill up you couldn't carry the gunny sack anymore. So I'd have a little bucket and put in. I was, 5, 6, 7 years old. And at the end of the day, I'd have maybe one gunny sack full, and it was so heavy, and I couldn't budge it. But for every gunny sack that you would fill, you'd get $1. So that was where you got paid. Now, migrant workers, they could fill these sacks up real fast, and they'd make some money. But for a young guy, I also lost my interest and grew to dislike picking cucumbers. So anyway, then I can remember Grandpa standing by barrels, and he'd have to take the top off the barrel, and then he'd fill them. And I can remember Grandpa standing there with his knife, and he's taking cloves of garlic, peeling them, and dropping them in there, and then he'd put cucumbers in, and he'd add his ingredients. And I remember him just standing there telling me stories, and I just thought that was really cool. Because, here's Grandpa telling me all about the old days, and he said at one point before I was around, he had up to 1,000 barrels of pickles. Now, we put together one barrel, and it's a lot of work. I can't imagine 1,000 barrels of pickles, but that's what Grandpa did, and he was telling me stories about it. And he told me where the shed was, where they had them stored, and we used to play in a big hole in the ground there where that's where the shed was. And Grandpa says that's where the warehouse was. When the fire came, it destroyed hundreds and hundreds of barrels of pickles, and they kind of went out of business, but not totally. So Grandpa kind of started rebuilding the business. I think that was probably in the 40s when the big fire came through and kind of wiped that out. And then he'd tell me about when they tried to sell pickles. They had them in North Dakota and Minnesota, and that his, my dad, his son Nash, was the part of his job was to be peddling pickles around the neighborhood and the surrounding states. And I don't know, Grandpa he would sit there and just tell me story after story. He'd tell me hunting stories, and I'm just sitting there watching him as he's peeling this stuff, putting it in the barrels, and just listening to Grandpa tell stories. It was just, it's a good memory, just a real good memory. One other thing I wanted to tell you about was when we were kids, Grandpa had this water tower where he used to mix the brine. He'd fill this water tower full of water, they'd dump the salt in there, and they'd run a hose from there down and fill all these barrels instead of just doing it a bucket at a time. And but as time went on, the structure got not as safe, couldn't hold these hundreds of gallons of water up there, and so they abandoned it. But the tower was still there, the big Sunray Farm sign was still on it, and but they weren't using it anymore. So as kids got the idea, still 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, we'd crawl up this tower and we'd crawl into this big tub up there. It was like 8 feet across and maybe 6, 8 feet tall. It was big and great for it. We'd hide up there from our folks or from whoever we could hide from. It was just a great fun place to be, but pretty soon the folks seen that we were crawling up there and thought, that don't look safe. The kids could get hurt. So our fort got destroyed. They pulled her down and destroyed it. But we had a lot of fun for a couple of years doing that. So that was, Grandpa's thought of his business was one. Us kids was just like, let's just have fun with it, And so some more of the kind of fun, foolish things we used to do when I was little, when Grandpa would go over and get helpers from like Fargo or Moorhead to get some migrant workers to help them do his stuff. Grandpa had large tents, and the tents had great big poles in them, and I don't know whether they stayed in there at night or whether that was just a place to get out of the sun. But when we were kids, still like that 5, 6, 7-year-old, these tents, we'd get a ladder and get up on the edge of these tents, and we'd crawl up to the peak of these tents, and we'd slide down the tent. Grandpa would come, and he'd be so mad at us, he'd get off of them tents, you guys. Now, whether he thought we were going to get hurt or whether we were going to wreck his tent, I don't know, but it was so much fun. That tent was so spongy to crawl to the top, and 2 or 3 of us kids at a time, we'd slide down there and we had a blast doing that. But, Grandpa and Grandma and my folks, they all had different ideas. We're going to get hurt or you're going to wreck something. So, but that was just more of the foolishness we did for kids. That was part of the pickle business, but we were having fun doing other things. So,
watch more about Perrine's son, Ray Pickles, next week on Museum Roadshow.